first time I saw the water gushing down my driveway like a busted dam, I thought maybe a pipe had exploded under the deck. It was early afternoon, sun blazing high, and the roar of water had my dog barking in panic. But when I ran to the backyard, what I saw made my knees lock in shock. My entire swimming pool 12 feet deep, a project I had spent years designing, was draining into the street like a miniature flood. Standing there with her arms crossed and a smug grin plastered across her red, sweating face was Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood. She wasn't even holding a permit or a notice, just her wide-brimmed sun hat, her ridiculous clipboard, and a garden hose shoved deep into the pool's drainage valve. She screamed over the rush of water that I was in violation of federal chemical disposal law, and that she had full authority under HOA bylaws to enforce immediate compliance. My heart was hammering, but my mind snapped into steel. There was just one glaring problem. Home wasn't in her HOA. I had moved into this house precisely because it was outside the suffocating reach of any homeowners association. The realtor swore it, the paperwork confirmed it, and my title deed had no attached covenants. Yet here was Karen, sweaty and furious, emptying 40,000 gallons of clean water into the storm drain as if she were Moses parting the Red Sea. I shouted at her to stop, but she just sneered, yelling that the Environmental Protection Agency would fine me, that chlorine was basically a war crime against the wetlands, and that she was saving the neighborhood from ecological collapse. I almost laughed at the absurdity, but the sight of my pool bottom cracking in the sun filled me with a rage I couldn't contain. The neighbors began gathering along the fence line. Some looked horrified, some amused, but all were whispering as if watching a circus unfold. Karen raised her voice higher, pointing at me like an accuser in a medieval trial, shouting that I was a criminal, that my house would be seized, and that federal marshals would come by tomorrow. That's when I noticed her husband, a thin man who always avoided eye contact, clutching a folder in the background. He looked miserable, as if he had begged her not to do this, but she shoved him aside and strutted around my yard as though she owned it. The image burned into my memory, her fat figure framed against the vanishing pool, declaring herself judge, jury, and executioner. I stormed back inside and grabbed my folder of deeds and property records. When I marched back out, I raised the papers like a preacher holding a Bible. My voice cracked through the murmurs of the crowd. Karen, you don't control this house. I am not part of your HOA. You are trespassing, vandalizing my property, and every second of this is being recorded. I pointed to the security camera above the garage, its little red light blinking steadily. Karen froze for half a beat, then cackled, saying no court would take my side, that she was acting under community mandate. Her words dripped with arrogance, but behind them I sensed a flicker of fear. That was when the twist came crashing in. A silver SUV pulled up, and out stepped my sister Elena, sharp, decisive, and dressed in the khaki uniform of a state environmental officer. She had come unannounced, visiting on her lunch break, only to stumble straight into the chaos. The crowd parted for her like Moses for the sea, and Karen's voice faltered. Elena looked from the emptying pool to the hose jammed into the valve, then to me. Who authorized this? She demanded. Karen puffed herself up, waving her clipboard. I did. I am the HOA president, and this man is illegally disposing hazardous waste. Elena's eyes narrowed into slits. She held up her badge, sunlight gleaming off the insignia. Funny thing, she said, because the HOA has no jurisdiction here, and dumping pool water into a storm drain without state clearance is itself a violation. Lady, you're the one breaking the law. The silence that fell afterward was thunderous. Neighbors gawked. Phones lifted to record. Karen's husband turned pale. For the first time in all the years I'd known her bluster, Karen's jaw twitched with doubt. She tried to stammer something about protecting the wetlands, but Elena cut her down with the precision of a scalpel. Do you even have water testing data? A disposal permit? Anything at all? Karen waved her clipboard weakly, revealing nothing but handwritten notes about community morale and aesthetic concerns. Elena snatched the hose from the valve, slammed it on the ground, and warned Karen that she could be held personally liable for damages. But Karen wasn't finished. She lunged into a screaming fit, accusing my sister of being a fake officer, shouting that the entire system was corrupt, and that she had whistleblower status. The neighbors actually laughed at that, and a few started clapping sarcastically. Someone yelled, "She's busted now." The humiliation washed over her. But instead of retreating, she doubled down, storming toward my porch and declaring that my very house was built in violation of zoning law. I stepped between her and the steps, my chest tight with fury, and told her plainly, "Cross this line, and I will have you arrested for trespassing." The tension was unbearable, the kind of moment where you could hear a pin drop under the roar of blood in your ears. Karen raised her chin, daring me to move. But then her husband, trembling, finally spoke up. His voice cracked as he admitted he had warned her about this, that she had no authority, that she had forged signatures on community mandates just to feel powerful. His words hung like a guillotine blade in the summer air. Neighbors gasped, some whispering they had suspected as much. And just like that, the narrative shattered. The queen had been dethroned not by force, but by the truth spilling out of her own household. I looked into her eyes and saw for the first time not just arrogance, but panic. She tried to shush him, but he shook her off, saying he was done living in fear of her crusades. Elena pulled out her phone, calling in a report to her office, while I documented the damage to my pool. The neighbors recorded every second. What had begun as Karen's triumphant act of self-righteous law enforcement had turned into her public unmasking. And though she kept screaming, her words were hollow now, stripped of authority, bouncing off the walls of reality she could no longer bend. The street felt like a stage, and everyone in the neighborhood was watching the play unfold. Except this was no act. Karen's power was draining away faster than the water had poured out of my pool, and still she tried to roar back. She demanded that Elena show federal paperwork, proving her authority, and when Elena calmly flipped her badge again, Karen accused her of being part of a conspiracy between me and state regulators. The irony was almost unbearable. The woman who had trespassed, vandalized, and humiliated herself now flailed like a child caught stealing candy. But Elena wasn't just standing on ceremony. She leaned into Karen's face and informed her that the State Environmental Board would open an official investigation into her actions. Karen's lips quivered as she tried to pivot, claiming she was just a concerned citizen, and that the HOA board had authorized her to act. That's when three voices shouted back from the crowd neighbors who had served on the HOA board years ago. They shouted that Karen had unilaterally seized power, that elections had been rigged, and that she never had legitimate authority. It was like watching a house of cards collapse with the flick of a finger. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I had posted a short clip of the water flooding out of the pool to a neighborhood group chat, and by the time I pulled it up, dozens of comments had exploded across the feed. People were outraged, furious at Karen's arrogance, shocked that she dared to claim federal law as her weapon while breaking it herself. A few tagged the local news station, and in minutes a reporter texted me privately asking if they could come by. My pulse raced. It was no longer just a backyard fiasco, it was about to go public. Karen must have sensed it too. She grabbed her husband's folder and tore at the papers inside, screaming that everything was classified HOA business. Pages fluttered across the yard, some landing in the water streaming down the street. Elena bent to pick one up, her eyes widening as she scanned the text. It was a fake citation notice with my address printed across the top and an invented violation code. She looked at me, then at the cameras recording, and shook her head slowly. "Forgery," she muttered. "This is criminal." The crowd hissed like a living creature. People were done whispering. They were shouting now. "You forged that. You stole from us. She's out of control." It was the first time I'd ever seen Karen's army of enablers turn against her. Her face flushed purple. She spat accusations at everyone, saying we were all traitors to community standards. She stomped up the lawn, trying to get in my house, but I planted myself firmly in the doorway. The line was drawn literally my threshold, the limit of her imagined empire. And then came the sirens. The sound grew louder until two police cruisers rolled to a stop at the curb. The officers stepped out, hands resting near their belts, eyes sweeping over the scene. One of them recognized Elena immediately, greeting her formally, and she laid out the entire situation in calm, precise words. Karen, however, couldn't stand the sight of her audience turning to real authority. She ran at the officers, waving her clipboard, shouting that she had already made a citizen's arrest, and that I was the criminal. One officer raised a hand, firm but patient, and told her to back away. She didn't. She shoved the clipboard into his chest and called him corrupt. That was the last straw. They cuffed her right there on my lawn. The entire block erupted, some gasps, some applause, even a cheer from the teenagers who had been secretly live-streaming. Her husband crumpled onto the curb, covering his face with both hands. The queen of the HOA, who moments ago had been screaming about federal marshals, was now the one being read her rights. I should have felt nothing but triumph, but as the adrenaline wore down, a deeper current of sadness cut through me. I looked at my cracked, empty pool and felt the sting of loss. Years of savings, labor, and pride drained away with the water. Elena put a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Don't worry, she'll pay for this." And she was right. With the evidence of forgery, vandalism, and trespassing stacked high, Karen's downfall had only begun. The following days were a whirlwind. The news crew arrived before sunset that same evening, their van lights washing over the ruined pool. I stood in front of the camera and told the story not with anger, but with calm precision. I showed the deed proving I wasn't in the HOA, the camera footage of Karen draining the pool, and even the forged citation Elena had retrieved. The story aired that night, and by the next morning, it had spread across the city. Comments poured in, mostly horrified at the abuse of power, but many thankful that someone had finally stood up to her. Karen posted rants on social media from her account, claiming she was the victim of a smear campaign. She blamed me, the police, even her own husband for betrayal. But the tide of public opinion was too strong. Parents in the neighborhood admitted she had bullied their kids. Elderly residents confessed she had fined them into debt for imaginary violations. Once the dam cracked, the flood of stories never stopped. She had ruled by intimidation for too long, and now everyone was free to speak. The twist that sealed her fate came from where nobody expected. A retired federal judge who lived 3 streets over quietly stepped forward, presenting letters Karen had sent to him threatening federal seizure of his property if he didn't comply with her lawn code. He had kept them for years, assuming nobody would believe him. Now those letters, stacked neatly in his hand, became the hammer of justice. With forgery, harassment, and fraud all tied together, the case against Karen solidified like concrete. Weeks later, when she stood in court, her bluster was gone. No hat, no clipboard, no crowd to command. Just a trembling woman facing charges that could ruin her life. I was called to testify, and as I spoke about that afternoon, I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. The truth was enough: the sight of her draining my pool, the lies she screamed, the forgery in her folder. When the jury looked at me, I saw the same disgust they felt for her, and I knew the verdict was inevitable. Karen was convicted on multiple counts: criminal mischief, trespassing, and forgery. She received fines that bankrupted her and community service hours that left her picking up trash under the same neighbors she had once terrorized. The HOA itself collapsed, disbanded by a unanimous vote once her corruption was exposed. For the first time in years, the neighborhood breathed free. And yet, out of the wreckage came something beautiful. Neighbors began to talk to one another, no longer through Karen's threats but through genuine care. We rebuilt the community not with rules and punishments, but with shared work. People volunteered to help me repair the pool. Kids painted murals on fences instead of hiding from fines. We even organized a block party, where laughter replaced the fear Karen had spread for so long. As for me, I stood at that party by my newly filled pool, restored not by vengeance, but by kindness, and looked around at the faces lit with freedom. Elena clinked her glass against mine, proud that justice had been served. Even Karen's husband showed up quietly, this time free from her shadow, finally speaking with neighbors as an equal. Karen herself never returned to the neighborhood. She moved away in shame, leaving behind nothing but the bitter memory of her arrogance. And yet, her downfall left a legacy proof that abuse of power crumbles when faced with truth and solidarity. I often thought of the moment the officers clicked the cuffs around her wrists, the crowd exploding in release, and how quickly tyranny turned into liberation. The board that once ruled with fear was gone, and in its place grew something stronger: unity. My pool became more than water and concrete. It became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that no one person, no matter how loud or entitled, could break the spirit of a community that chooses courage over silence. So now I share this story not as revenge, but as a lesson. When someone abuses power, when they scream laws that don't exist and tear down what others have built, the best answer isn't rage alone. It's truth. The standing firm, letting the world see, and refusing to bow. And to you reading this, ask yourself, was Karen truly fighting for law and community, or only for her own power? Was I wrong to fight back? Or was this the justice she brought upon herself? Share your thoughts, because silence lets tyrants grow, but truth makes them fall.